Okay, so before we get started today, I want to just briefly go over some of the programs that I'm going to be implementing. And I think it'll be useful for you because as you start doing DTT programs, you need to be familiar with some of the really basic categories of programs that you're going to be implementing. So remember, before we talked about program books and how they should be organized according to areas of development and based on program similarities. So I wanted to cover some definitions today. I want you to add them in to your SafMed cards. And then I can give you specific examples of those programs and then demonstrate them for you. So Skinner is, and you've read some of his articles before in our training, he's really the father of verbal behavior. And a lot of what we teach is verbal behavior. And so as we go through, we can kind of organize some of our programs by them. So I want to start off with some operants that he really identified as being crucial with teaching. So the first is amend, okay? So on one side of your card you should have the term mand, and then on the other side, simply put, making a request. Manding is crucial because you're going to come across that almost every second of the day when you're working with a learner. And it's one of the most basic steps to learning. Remember, we talked about this when we were talking about the motivation and the value behind programs and how often we'll start with a manding program because it's going to be so motivating for a student to engage in that program material because they make requests for things that they want, and as soon as they make that request, you can give them access to it. So it's that immediate gratification, okay? So manding programs are incredibly important. Often I will use a completely separate manding program in order to really increase my learners' ability to mand for a variety of items. And I'll teach that one separately today. Then next to manding, we also have tacting. Tacting, as Skinner defines, so on one side of the card, write the term tact. And then on the other side, we're not going to go overly scientific here. Skinner identifies it as a verbal operant under the functional control of a nonverbal discriminative stimulus, and it produces generalized condition reinforcement. That's a very lengthy term or wording for the fact that a tact is the label for an item. So on the back side of your card, for the definition, you can write a label of an item. But what Skinner was trying to get at here is that in the presence of that labeling of an item, correct labeling or discriminating that item and its label compared to something else provides reinforcement in some way, okay? So that essentially means, like, if I was asking you to say, what is it? And you were able to tact red car, good, that is the red car, right? So in the presence of the red car, when you appropriately tact red car, you got reinforced for it. That's what a tact is. But if you accidentally labeled this one as red car, I'm not going to reinforce you or tell you you did a good job, okay? So only in the presence of something where someone else provides you reinforcement for it is how you learn that tact, right? That's the label, correct. That is the label of that. That's a red card. That's a yellow card. That's a blue card. Okay, the ability to discriminate between the features and accurately identify that item depending on its features, functions, or class. Okay, so that's a tact. The next is echoic. So your term on one side of your SafMed should be echoic. And then on the opposite side, you can write a definition that says imitation using point-to-point correspondence. Okay, so, and it has to be a verbal imitation, sorry, so verbal imitation that has point-to-point correspondence. And echoics are obviously incredibly useful because we can teach language, right? So we're teaching someone to say car, so you might start with, say, k, and they do the k, good, and then we can shape that into the word car. So then your expectation for the learner, that response is, say car, the whole word. And then they say car, okay, but they say it perfectly. So the initial sound, the middle A, and then ending with the R. That point-to-point correspondence. Each point in that word, they have to match exactly. It's not say car and they say cob. That's not point-to-point, right? They don't all exactly match. So echoic means that I echo or I say whatever you say exactly the same. Along with echoics, and this isn't part of Skinner's core pieces to verbal behavior, are what we call imitation programs. Okay, imitation programs are incredibly important as well, because imitation programs are crucial to teaching learners to imitate others, and that's how a lot of learning happens in the natural environment, right? Monkey see, monkey do. A child watches another child blow through a hoop after putting it in some crazy liquid, and all of these bubbles come out, and they're like, oh my goodness, that's cool, I gotta try it. Next thing you know, they're running over and they're blowing bubbles, okay? And that's how real learning occurs. But for our kids with disabilities, not all of them have that imitation ability, right? Because they have unusual interests. They're not the same as your typical learner. So we literally have to teach them imitation. And sometimes that starts off with very primitive skills. And you can look at some of our imitation programs in here. Often that prompt is given with a do this. It's do this followed by any behavior that you want them to imitate. But always that prompt is just the do this verbiage, and then they're supposed to imitate whatever you do. And so the hope is once they learn that skill, that they can accurately respond when given a do this prompt, then in the future, you can start to have them imitate their peers. Either their peers ask them to do this, and they clap after their peers, or they go out onto the playground and they're used to imitating their peers, and then all of a sudden you see them naturally following them onto different playscape equipment, or naturally watching them pick up an object that their peer just picked up in the kitchen where they were pretending to cook. Okay, that's fantastic. But sometimes we need to explicitly teach that imitation skill. And just following through, I'm going to go over one last piece with Skinner's components to verbal behavior here, and that's intraverbal. So kind of doing that fill in the blank. So on one side, your term should be intraverbal. And then on the other side, you can say a fill-in-the-blank statement or a word that elicits a response. Okay, here, there isn't any point-to-point correspondence because an intraverbal is used to elicit more language from a learner or get them to start doing that more complex process of having a conversation, so that you say one thing and then they come back with another response, and then you can respond to that, and then they come back with another. Okay, it's almost essentially like a volley back and forth between language. And the hope is that in time, they naturally have a responding ability and can maintain more complex communication. But at its most simplest form, we teach intraverbals to some kids using things like singing the song and then leaving off that last piece. So Old MacDonald had a farm, E-I-E-I-O, okay? So they're actually finishing in something, or they're responding, they're filling in a blank to continue some sort of quote-unquote conversation or verbal experience, okay? Another frequent intraverbal program that you'll see is something like you read a, and then they fill in book, right? Or you could do something like you live in a house. All of those are intraverbals, okay? All right, so there are a few other things that Skinner talks about in here. I don't expect you to write them down because they're more complex, but you might come across them. One is textual. Textual is when you read, basically. It's when you're looking at something in one modality and then you can use it in another. So you might be reading something, but you're gaining information from it, okay? There isn't point-to-point correspondence. Then the other one is transcription. Transcription is more writing or spelling. So taking something that you already know and actually writing it out. Or you can hear something and then write it down. So, you know, a perfect example would be one of those people in court that has to transcribe, right, everything that's said. So they hear everything that's going on and then they document it with point-to-point correspondence on paper, okay? All right. So for the purposes of Skinner's operants, that's pretty good. It gives you a sound base. There's just a few other things that I wanted to touch upon with our programs in here that Skinner doesn't necessarily touch upon, but they are crucial in our programming. So we have expressive and receptive programs. Expressive and receptive you can find without a variety of different domains of learning, but the two main differences is that receptive, you're expecting the individual to take in information, receive something from you, and then demonstrate their knowledge about it. Okay, so for example, I could have a receptive program that says color ID, right? So I put out two colors in front of my learner, purple and red, and I'm going to receptively ask them to identify the color red. So I'll say, touch red. Good, that's touching red, okay? So they're receiving information and demonstrating to me that they understand that information or that direction. Whereas, the parallel to that is expressive programming, where they're going to take in the information and express somehow that they understand it, right? So instead, an expressive program would be using the same thing, color ID with these two balls. What color? And they say out loud, red. Okay, they're expressing. Typically, your learner has to be able to verbalize and have expressive language and able to take advantage of those expressive programs, okay? Some other examples are, if I was doing expressive versus receptive, we've got a car and a ball. If I was doing picture ID and I did it receptively, I would say, touch the car. The learner would touch the car. Good, that is the car. Expressively, what is it? And they say out loud, car, okay? So you can see how different the programs are, but they support one another, so that the learner doesn't only understand to identify an object, but they're also able to identify it expressively, okay? So that they have a well-rounded learning program, okay? So, going to set up our program materials, make sure that all of my antecedents are in place, and then get our learner to join us.